Which is, of course, the fear of so many right now as we're waiting for Donald Trump to arrive and meet with Vladimir Putin for what he calls a summit, for what the United States ambassador to Russia calls a meeting. Let's bring in right now a U.S. Senator from the state of Connecticut and also a member of the Judiciary Committee, Richard Blumenthal. Senator Blumenthal, thanks for being with us. I'm curious what your reaction is to the shocking amount of forensic evidence, the detail that actually places the proverbial gun in the hand of Vladimir Putin in the undermining of American democracy, and what the next step should be for the United States Senate, the United States House, and the United States President.
The forensic evidence and the allegations, remember, every one of them supported by evidence of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, is enormously compelling. But also, equally important, is what's left unsaid to the Americans who are named in the indictment, not by name, but in fact, they are included, and the other Americans that may be targets of the investigation. There's also a message to the members of the House of Representatives who engaged in that stunning spectacle last week where they were essentially haranguing and harassing, continuing their concerted campaign to discredit and stop this investigation. It is about our national security. And the next step for the United States Congress has to be to persuade or compel the president to address this threat to our national security. It affects not only our American democracy, but also democracies around the world. And now more than ever, at a time of threat to Western democracy from this cyber attack by Vladimir Putin, we need to be rallying together. And I think the United States Senate is going to make an effort, as we did last week, by stating our commitment 97-2 for a resolution that says to NATO, we are with you, we want you to be with us, we are continuing to be committed, because we are facing a continuing act of war by Vladimir Putin. He has tried to divide us, cause disarray, and he will stop at nothing to destroy these Western democracies.
Senator, you said he would stop at nothing, but can't we introduce something to give something that might get him to stop? These indictments show a degree of knowledge about what the Russians are up to that's quite profound. And it seems to me implicit in that is we could we don't have to just play defense. We could play offense. Vladimir Putin cares nothing so much, he cares most about his own political position, his own personal wealth, and so forth. Do you think there would be support from your colleagues for essentially saying, here's the price you're going to pay for what you did? And by the way, if we find more evidence that you're carrying out acts of aggression against American politics, here's what we're going to do to weaken your political base. Here's what we're going to reveal about you. Here's ways that we can interfere with your ability to maintain control in Russia. Is that something you think there'd be support for?
I think there would be very, very strong support, bipartisan support, on the Armed Services Committee, where I also sit, as well as Judiciary Committee and the Senate as a whole, the Congress as a whole. And we can accomplish many of those ends by revealing some of the assets that Putin and his oligarchs have in this country and other Western democracy, some of the corruption that exists in his own country. If we want to name and shame, as Mueller is doing in his investigation, plus heightening sanctions, we need to hit back hard and make the Russians pay a price, and also define what cyber war means. What is an act of war in the cyber domain? We have been hit by one. We need to fight back, and I think there would be very strong support for going on the offense, not simply playing defense here.
Clint, do you think what Dan Coats is suggesting, and I was just trying to kind of unpick what he's saying when he says, look, to the Russians, if I was to say to the Russians, we know what you're doing, we know you know what you're doing, and if you want to get into a tit for tat, we will win this one. Is there serious conversations going on in the U.S. intelligence community about what that tit for tat would look like from an American perspective? What would be the retaliatory measures?
Well, without disclosing what I know from intelligence briefings that I received, the classified information that we've received, certainly there is a lot of consideration about what can be done. You heard Dan Coats describing the extent of the threat. I thought this summit, or whatever the meeting may be called, never should have taken place. Donald Trump should walk out of it if Vladimir Putin refuses to turn over those 12 Russian spies that are named for trial in this country. And I believe strongly that he ought to avoid the show sort of press conference that typically happens afterward. But there is serious discussion and has been for some time.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.